The sound of palm-meeting cheeks shattered the marble calm of the courthouse steps. Your head snapped sideways, the sting of the blow burning hotter than the morning sun. The briefcase slipped from your grasp, papers spilling across the stone. Orders, dockets, sealed memoranda scattering under the boots of men who were supposed to guard the law. Officer Martinez loomed above you, eyes sharp with contempt, voice dripping with cruelty. "Filthy animals like you don't belong in courthouses," he sneered, shoving you back against the wall as metal cuffs bit into your wrists. Laughter trickled from the other officers, their amusement as sharp as the slap itself. One leaned casually on the rail, smirking. Another tilted his phone, capturing your humiliation as if it were entertainment. You steadied your breathing, refusing to give them what they wanted: fear, tears, surrender. Instead, you fixed your gaze upward, past Martinez's sneer, past the gathering crowd, to the bronze plate above the grand doorway, the Honorable Judge K. Williams, presiding. 20 feet from your own courtroom, 20 feet from your seat of authority, you were being treated as a criminal in the very system you had sworn to defend. Inside, the echo of your footsteps was drowned by the officer's voice, polished and practiced. Suspicious individual, erratic behavior, attempted to breach security. His words fell in steady rhythm, rehearsed lies that drew nods from the temporary judge, a thin man with gray hair who didn't bother to look at you, only at the badge in front of him. You sat at the defense table, cuffs heavy, the bruise on your cheek beginning to swell. The whispers from the gallery were knives. "She doesn't belong here." Another one pretending. Probably caught with stolen files. But you didn't protest. Not yet. You let the story weave itself tighter around you, thread by thread, because you knew what waited at the end of it. The officer thought he had silenced you. The judge thought this was routine. The gallery thought they were watching another humiliation. But what came next silenced the entire room. The murmur began as a ripple, small and hushed, the kind of whisper that lives in courtrooms when order is slipping but no one dares admit it. A clerk in the gallery leaned to her neighbor. "What did she do?" Another voice answered with that dismissive half-smile tone you've heard too many times before. "Doesn't matter. You can tell just by looking." The words didn't need to be shouted. They were sharp enough to cut even at a whisper. You sat in your chair, the cuffs heavy against your wrists, while the story rewrote itself around you. In their eyes, you were no longer a woman walking to work. You were a trespasser, a criminal, a stereotype they could fold neatly into a narrative they'd rehearsed for years. The prosecutor shuffled her papers with quiet satisfaction. She didn't need evidence. She had Officer Martinez's voice, polished and practiced. Erratic, suspicious, uncooperative. The words landed like stamps on a file, final, unquestioned, familiar. Each one drew nods from the gallery, as though the truth were something they'd agreed upon in advance. From the corner, an older bailiff smirked, muttering under his breath, another one playing the victim card. His colleague chuckled softly. Their laughter wasn't loud, but it was enough to twist the air, enough to remind you that this was their domain, not yours. At least not yet. You lowered your gaze, not in submission, but in strategy. Eyes on the table, but your mind sharp, calculating. Every insult, every dismissal. They weren't weights dragging you down. They were notes in a symphony you were letting them compose, unaware that you would conduct the finale. "Look at her clothes," someone whispered. "Not even dressed like she belongs here." The remark cut deeper than the slap had. Your blazer, simple but professional, suddenly seemed like a costume in their eyes. They saw what they wanted, not a judge on her way to chambers, but a trespasser pretending at respectability. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his pen tapping against the bench in a rhythm that made the courtroom feel smaller. "Officer Martinez," he said, "your account aligns with what we expect in these situations." His tone dripped with approval. Not a word for you, not a question about the bruise across your cheek, just validation for the story already being written. And the gallery, they were feeding on it. Nods, murmurs, glances passed between them like a secret handshake. Each face told you the same thing. They believed him. Not because his story was airtight, but because it was convenient. It confirmed what they already thought about you. But what they didn't know was that the very walls around them had seen everything. The cameras mounted above the doors, the feeds stored automatically in digital archives, the evidence waiting like an arrow pulled back, ready to strike. They thought the narrative was complete, but you knew it was only the prologue. The officer's voice boomed again, louder now, as if volume could cement the lies. She was combative, threatening, dangerous. The words carried weight, but you noticed the tremor at the edge of his tone, a flicker of doubt. He knew what he had done, and somewhere deep inside, he knew the truth had a way of surfacing. The whispers grew bolder. These people always act this way. Should have known better. Another fraud. Each word was a stone, meant to bury you beneath prejudice. And for now, you let them pile on. Because stones, when gathered carefully, can also build a foundation. The prosecutor glanced at you with a smile that didn't hide its contempt. She saw an easy win. A defendant with no voice, no advocate, no chance. What she didn't see was the calm in your eyes, the steadiness of someone who has lived through storms before, and knows the difference between weather and fate. As the testimony wound on, as the whispers circled like vultures, the gavel tapped again. The temporary judge cleared his throat, ready to close the matter. The gallery leaned in, eager to watch another routine humiliation conclude. But what came next silenced the entire room. Shadows have weight. They press against you when no one else notices. And as you sat shackled at the defense table with whispers still crawling through the courtroom air, the shadows of your past rose. Each one not to crush you, but to steady you. Your cheek burned where the officer's palm had landed, but your mind drifted elsewhere. Long nights bent over law books, the sound of your own pen scratching through fatigue, the echo of professors questioning whether students like you had the discipline for this field. You remembered those lecture halls at Harvard, towering windows, oak desks, the cold glances when you raised your hand. They had expected you to fall silent. Instead, you had learned to speak with precision. Another one playing victim, a voice whispered in the gallery now. It pulled you back to the present. But you almost smiled, because you had heard versions of that sentence your entire life. From the admissions office clerk who questioned your scholarship, from the senior partner who called you the diversity hire, from the judge who once mistook you for a secretary before you stood to argue the case that won the day. Each slight had been carved into your memory, and now each cut was sharpening you for this exact moment. Your fingers twitched against the cuffs, brushing the small platinum pin still resting against your lapel. Its weight was subtle, but its meaning was not. Most saw jewelry, a few saw wealth. Almost no one recognized it for what it was. A gift from your first mentor on the bench, engraved on the back with a single phrase, "For the moments they think you're powerless." That phrase had carried you through trials that weren't in law books. It would carry you through this one, too. The prosecutor's voice cut across your thoughts, sharp and confident. The defendant, she said, savoring the word, shows the classic signs of deceit. No identification, inconsistent story, suspicious documents. Her tone dripped with practiced disdain. The gallery nodded along. You let them. Because you knew what rested in your briefcase, scattered across the courthouse steps, but cataloged in your mind. Dockets you had signed yourself, memoranda with your initials, correspondence with seals they could not dispute. Your mind wandered further back, to the first time you stood in chambers alone. You were 27, still carrying student loan debt heavier than your salary. The robe had felt like armor then, awkward and oversized, until you realized it wasn't meant to fit your body. It was meant to fit the oath you had taken. Over time, it molded itself around you. And when you wore it, you never thought of how you looked. You thought only of what you stood for. "See how calm she is?" someone muttered. "Guilty people always look calm." The words landed with the same laziness as a hand swatting flies. You had seen juries make that mistake before, confusing composure with guilt. You didn't need to defend yourself to them. Not yet. Martinez spoke again, his voice rising with righteous indignation. Your Honor, people like her always claim to be judges, senators, attorneys, anything to dodge accountability. But we know the truth. We see it every day. His words pressed down like chains. They thought his uniform gave him truth, and your bruise gave you guilt. You leaned back, letting the cold wood of the chair seep into your bones. And you remembered another night, years ago, standing outside the Department of Justice as a young prosecutor. The marble columns loomed overhead. You had just finished arguing a civil rights case against a police officer who had brutalized a teenager. You remembered your closing line. Power unchecked is not authority. It is theft. The jury had believed you then. They would believe you again. The bailiff returned, a garment bag in his hands, a wooden box tucked under his arm. He moved quickly, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes darting to the brass plate above the chamber doors. He had recognized you. He hadn't spoken it aloud, not yet, but the recognition itself was a fracture in the narrative Martinez was weaving, and fractures have a way of spreading. You let your eyes fall shut for a moment, drawing a long breath. The memories lined up inside you like soldiers, each one a reminder of battles already fought. The insults, the rejections, the bruises invisible and visible. They thought today's slap was a humiliation. What they didn't know was that you had been slapped before. By life, by arrogance, by systemic walls. And every time, you had stood back up, stronger, sharper. This courtroom wasn't your cage, it was your stage. The prosecutor kept speaking, but you barely heard her. Instead, your mind fixed on the engraved words inside the box the bailiff now clutched. Words etched into the handle of your ceremonial gavel. Justice is blind, but she sees all. That phrase wasn't just a motto, it was a promise. And promises, when kept, change everything. You opened your eyes, steady and clear. The whispers around you were louder now, layered with judgment, prejudice, certainty of your downfall. They thought they were watching another routine humiliation. They thought this story was already over. But what came next silenced the entire room. The first vibration came from the back row. A soft chime, a glowing screen, a startled gasp. Someone had uploaded the slap. Not as rumor, not as whispers, but as video. The pixelated truth leapt from one phone to another, then to another, like sparks catching dry timber. Within minutes, the courthouse was no longer sealed by its walls. Its story was leaking into every corner of the city. You could see it in the shifting posture of the gallery. Clerks glanced down at their screens, pale with recognition. Attorneys adjusted ties nervously, whispering to one another about damage control. And the officers who had laughed outside suddenly grew rigid, aware that the cruelty they had treated as routine now had an audience they could not control. Officer Martinez felt it too. His voice, steady just moments ago, cracked on a word he had spoken 100 times before. Combative, he said, but the syllables betrayed him. His eyes darted toward the door as though expecting reporters to burst in. He knew how quickly narratives could spin out of his hands once cameras got involved. You sat perfectly still, letting the storm swirl. On the table before you, the scattered remnants of your papers had been gathered into a neat stack. Court. Memos, sealed orders, case notes. The bailiff's hand trembled slightly as he set them down, as if realizing that the documents he had once dismissed as suspicious might, in fact, carry signatures that outranked his entire career. Judge Harrison leaned forward, pen still tapping, oblivious to the shift. He saw only the performance at the witness stand. Officer Martinez, he said, continue with your account. Martinez did, but the rhythm was gone. His testimony, once smooth, now stumbled. He claimed you resisted. He claimed you shouted threats. He claimed you fought. Yet every word he spoke was now shadowed by the knowledge that beyond these walls, people were already seeing something else. The slap, the choke, the contempt etched on his face. And it wasn't just anonymous viewers. Reporters had ways of listening before they entered. A young clerk at the rear whispered, "Channel 7 is already outside." Another muttered, "I think CNN picked it up." The whispers spread like smoke. The prosecutor stiffened in her seat, suddenly less certain of her easy victory. Your heart beat steady, not because you were unshaken, but because you knew this moment was part of the rhythm. You had felt it before, in closing arguments when jurors shifted in their seats, in negotiations when opposing counsel blinked too quickly. The rhythm always announced itself before the tide turned. The bailiff who had recognized you earlier now avoided your eyes, but the way his jaw tightened told you he understood. He had seen the brass plate. He had seen the robe folded in the bag. He had seen enough to know that the story Martinez was spinning could not last. Still, the insults didn't stop. Look at her smirk, someone hissed from the gallery. She thinks, this is a game, another voice. She's going to jail and she knows it. The words landed like stones, but each one was another reminder of what they would have to eat when the truth surfaced. The prosecutor rose again, her voice sharpened to mask unease. Your Honor, this defendant's behavior fits a troubling pattern. False claims, exaggerated injuries, attempts to paint herself as the victim. She glanced at you with a smile meant to be final. We've all seen this before. You met her gaze, calm and steady. Yes, you thought. You have seen this before. But never like this. The officer held up his phone, offering grainy footage that began only after the slap, carefully curated to support his version. But even as he angled the screen toward the bench, other phones in the gallery buzzed louder, carrying sharper, uncut versions of the same event. Reality was multiplying faster than he could contain it. You leaned back, cuffs pressing into your skin, and allowed yourself a small breath. The walls of this courtroom thought they were impenetrable, but the truth had already slipped through. And soon it would come back crashing in. But what came next silenced the entire room. The hush that settled over the courtroom was heavy, fragile, and electric. For the first time since the slap, all eyes fixed on you, not as a defendant, not as a spectacle, but as a question waiting to be answered. Martinez's voice had faltered. The prosecutor's certainty had cracked, and the murmurs from the gallery had become something else entirely. Anticipation. You rose slowly, the chains clinking as you adjusted your posture. The bruise on your cheek was visible, swollen and angry, but the calm in your eyes swallowed the room whole. You didn't shout, you didn't protest. You simply said, with a composure that startled even the stenographer, Your Honor, I would like to clarify my identity. Judge Harrison frowned. The court is not in the business of indulging stories. Sit down. But you didn't. Instead, you nodded toward the evidence table. Among those documents, you said evenly, you will find memoranda bearing my initials, sealed, orders with my authorization stamp, and today's docket signed under my authority. The bailiff who had recognized you earlier shifted uneasily, his eyes darting to the stack. His face paled further. He knew what he had seen before, the signature, the seal, the unmistakable handwriting of the presiding judge of this very courthouse. Martinez scoffed, attempting to regain control. Your Honor, she's lying. Anyone could forge documents, but your hands moved with measured precision. From your jacket pocket, you withdrew a worn leather credential wallet. Its surface glowed, faintly under the overhead lights. You placed it on the table, flipped it open, and let the gold seal inside gleam across the room. Silence deepened. Identification, you said softly, which the officer refused to examine. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the prosecutor leaned forward, straining to see. Judge Harrison blinked, his pen stilled mid-tap. You weren't finished. In addition, I have my judicial access card, you continued, withdrawing a small plastic badge with embedded codes, the kind that unlocked doors this officer had never seen. Programmed for my chambers and restricted areas of this courthouse. You set it down next to the wallet, each movement deliberate. Then, from the wooden box the bailiff had returned moments before, you lifted the gavel. Its polished handle caught the light, and the engraving on its side. Justice is blind, but she sees all, burned like scripture across the silence. You held it not as evidence, but as inheritance. Officer Martinez, you said at last, turning to face him fully. You may not have recognized me this morning, but every wall in this courthouse does. Martinez's jaw clenched, his lips parting as if to argue, but no words came. His eyes darted to the brass plate above the chamber door, the one that had silently borne your name for years. The Honorable Judge K. Williams, presiding. His face drained of color. The prosecutor stammered, This must be some mistake. It is, you cut in, but not mine. You placed the gavel on the bench with a quiet finality that echoed louder than the slap had. And then, for the first time, you let the smallest trace of a smile touch your lips. The gallery leaned forward, breath held, as though the building itself were waiting for the verdict. But what came next silenced the entire room. Collapse never comes in one thunderclap. It starts with cracks, hairline fractures in confidence, small tremors in voices, sideways glances that suddenly refuse to align. And in this courtroom, collapse began the moment your gavel touched the bench. The prosecutor was the first to falter. Her fingers, once so assured as they shuffled through, her files now fumbled against the papers. She dropped a pen, stooped to retrieve it, and in that instant you saw the panic she could no longer mask. The easy victory she had expected was gone, slipping between her hands like water. Your Honor, she tried, voice trembling, this individual cannot. But you raised one hand. The silence that followed was not requested, it was commanded. Even the stenographer paused, her machine waiting for your words instead of theirs. Officer Martinez shifted in his seat, his earlier bravado draining with each second. Sweat gathered at his temple. His eyes darted toward the door, toward the gallery, toward anyone who might save him. But the very walls around him had turned against him, for they remembered. And now, you were their voice. Officer Martinez, you began, your voice measured but cold. This morning you testified under oath. You claimed I was erratic, uncooperative, threatening. You claimed I attempted to trespass with stolen documents. Do you recall your testimony? He swallowed hard, nodding. Good, you said, because now we will compare it with the record. You gestured toward the bailiff, who moved swiftly to wheel in a monitor. With one keystroke, the courtroom lit up with clarity no lie could withstand. Security footage, crisp and merciless, filled the screen. There you were, walking calmly toward the courthouse steps. There was Martinez blocking your path, his hand rising before his mouth ever opened. There was the slap, the brutal crack that silenced the steps and sent your briefcase spilling. His words rang out clear as glass. Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses. The gallery gasped, the sound rising like a storm. Attorneys leaned forward, horrified. Clerks covered their mouths. Even Judge Harrison shifted in his chair, his pen frozen mid-air. Martinez lurched forward. That footage is incomplete. It doesn't... But you pressed another key. A second angle appeared, this time from the body cam Martinez had claimed, had malfunctioned. Unedited, unforgiving. Every word he spoke, every shove, every laugh from his fellow officers. It was all there. The prosecutor's face went pale. She dropped her legal pad entirely this time, papers spilling at her feet. The gallery buzzed louder, their whispers turning sharp, turning condemning. Officer Martinez, you said, your voice carrying across the chamber. You swore an oath today, you lied beneath it. You assaulted a federal judge outside her own courtroom, then stood here and fabricated a tale to cover your crime. Martinez's knees buckled. He gripped the edge of the table for balance, but the strength that had fueled his arrogance had vanished. Officer Rodriguez, Officer Thompson. You turned toward the two men who had corroborated Martinez's lies. Do you wish to revise your testimony? Their silence spoke louder than any words. They looked down, away, toward the exit, their courage fleeing with their falsehoods. And then the collapse widened. The temporary Judge Harrison rose to his feet, his face ashen. I was misled. I acted in good faith. But you shook your head. Good faith does not excuse blindness. A nameplate above your bench bore my name, and still you chose not to look. The gavel struck once, a sound like final judgment. The gallery erupted, not in applause, not in cheers, but in a low murmur of reckoning. Everyone in the room understood. The tide had turned. The system that had been weaponized against you was folding in on itself. The lies, the arrogance, the prejudice, they were collapsing under the weight of evidence and truth. And for the first time, Martinez saw it in full. His career was gone, his reputation shredded, his power stripped bare. But what came next silenced the entire room. The courtroom had already cracked. Now it was time to bring it down. You rose from the bench, your robe settling on your shoulders like the armor it was always meant to be. The bruise on your cheek still burned, but now it glowed like a brand of authority, a reminder carved into your skin of what arrogance had dared to strike. "Officer Martinez," you said, your voice echoing across the chamber. "You once told me that actions have consequences." You leaned forward, eyes locked on him. "Let us examine yours." You opened a thick file placed discreetly on the bench. Your staff had brought it while the footage played. Inside lay years of complaints, each one dismissed, each one buried. Complaint number 1. You read aloud, filed in 2009. A grandmother alleges you called her a slur during a traffic stop. Dismissed. You flip to the next. Complaint number 12, 2012. A teenager accuses you of planting drugs. Dismissed. Complaint 23, 2016. A physician arrested outside his own home. Dismissed. With each page, the gallery shifted, their horror mounting. Each dismissal was a nail, and now you hammered them into the coffin of Martinez's career. You built your reputation on lies, you continued, your tone as cold as marble, and the system enabled you. But today, the system sits here. You tapped the bench, and so do I. Martinez's attorney whispered frantically in his ear, but it was useless. The officer sat slumped, his face gray, his body trembling with the weight of a lifetime unraveling in minutes. The prosecutor tried to speak again. "Your Honor, surely." "Silence," you cut her off. "This court will no longer entertain lies." You turned back to Martinez. For 15 years, you operated under the belief that your badge placed you above the law, that victims would be silenced, that justice would turn away. But today, justice is looking directly at you. The gavel in your hand gleamed under the lights. You lifted it slowly, deliberately. "Officer Martinez, based on your own recorded words and actions, this court finds you guilty of assault on a judicial officer, guilty of perjury under oath, guilty of depriving a citizen of her rights under color of law, and guilty of disgracing the very badge you swore to honor." Each charge landed like a hammer blow. The gallery gasped, then hushed, hanging on every syllable. Martinez shook his head, his voice breaking. "Your Honor, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't care," you replied coldly. "You saw skin and assumed guilt. You saw a woman and assumed weakness. You saw power where there was none, and now you face power where you never expected it." The silence deepened. The air itself seemed to bow beneath the weight of your words. You leaned forward, your voice now barely above a whisper, forcing the entire room to strain and listen. "You told me this morning to know my place. Now, Officer Martinez, you will learn yours." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, shaking the chamber, sealing the verdict. The gallery erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper. Relief. Recognition. A collective exhale that justice, so long denied, had finally stood its ground. Martinez collapsed into his chair, his sobs echoing against the walls he once believed protected him. His career was over, his freedom now balanced on the very system he had mocked. And as the courtroom steadied, all eyes turned to you, not as a victim, not as a defendant, but as the embodiment of justice itself. You sat tall on your throne, robe draped, gavel in hand, your bruise now a crown. "Some lessons cost millions," you said quietly, your words carrying like a sentence carved in stone. For her, one slap cost everything. When the gavel's echo finally faded, the courtroom breathed again, not with noise, but with awe. The same. People who had whispered insults at your expense now sat stunned, unable to meet your gaze. What had begun as humiliation on the courthouse steps had ended in a reckoning none of them would ever forget. For Martinez, the consequences were swift and permanent. His badge was no shield. His lies were no shelter. The man who once strutted through these halls with arrogance was now reduced to silence, a warning carved into the memory of everyone present. His downfall was not just punishment. It was a reminder of the cost of cruelty. And for you, the bruise on your cheek remained, but it was no longer a mark of shame. It was a symbol, a reminder that dignity can survive insult, that truth can rise above lies, and that power, real power, is never taken, only revealed. As you left the bench that day, robe flowing, head high, the lesson lingered. Injustice thrives on silence, but collapses when truth finally speaks. Stories like these happen every day. Subscribe to never miss the truth behind the power.